Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the REPI Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. We are delighted to have with us today Zachariah Mampilly, who is the Marxe Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, CUNY, and a member of the doctoral faculty in the Department of Political Science at the Graduate Center, CUNY. He's co-founder of the Program on African Social Research and the author of a couple of books, Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance, and Civilian Life During War, and also with Adam Branch, Africa Uprising, Popular Protest, and Political Change. His writing appeared in a number of additional forums, Foreign Affairs, Jacobin, The Hindu, Africa as a Country, M+1, Dissent, Al Jazeera, The New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. And we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
I have been working on this project on rebel taxation pretty much since around 2016, 2017. And it's an ongoing project. So what I decided to do today is instead of simply talk about the paper that I shared with all of you, on the Indian case, I'll talk about the larger project that it's embedded within because it's an ongoing thing. And now we're starting to do something with UNU, the United Nations University, WIDER, which is the World Institute for Development Economics Research, that will be looking at conflict and taxation. It builds on some of these ideas. So it's an ongoing project, and I think there's more and more interest in this subject for reasons that I'm happy to discuss as I present. But I wanted to just kind of provide an overview of the larger project, and I'll talk about the India paper as well as another paper that I published recently on Colombia. And I've also been doing research in South Sudan, which I won't cover here, but I'm happy to talk about if anybody has a particular interest in that area. A very sort of basic question of can rebels tax? And this is something that has kind of haunted me since my first years in the PhD program, kind of discourse around how armed groups behave and how we should think about their behaviors, particularly when they replicate elements of state functions. And that's a topic I've been working on now for 2 decades under this sort of rubric of rebel governance. And this rebel taxation project sort of takes off from that starting point. And I mention this because my orientation when I first started graduate school was very much looking into sort of the political economy of war literature that was very popular at the time. You may be familiar with economists like Paul Collier, who were really portraying armed groups, any form of non-state actor, as terrorist organizations or criminal organizations. There was a whole sort of discourse around how their pursuit of violence was always driven by these underlying economic logics. And so I've spent, a couple decades now trying to challenge that framing of how we think about non-state armed groups. And ultimately, it has led me to this point where I'm actually just trying to do a political economy of armed groups and really try to understand the larger economic context in which they operate to push back again against that sort of framing. That the best way to think about armed groups is through various forms of criminality. And I heard one of you just talking now about criminal organizations, and I can talk a little bit more about the kind of emerging field of criminal governance that I think is also quite interesting in terms of rethinking how we approach the study of criminality more broadly. But let me talk about this more specifically. A starting point here is just to sort of frame the way in which we think about the concept of rebel taxation. Obviously, the specter of extortion looms large over most of the discourse around taxation. It's pretty much given. I have many, many examples from the media and the policy world where they equate any form of rebel taxation to forms of extortion. Here are just a couple that I am pointing out. The CNN headline, you can see how they slipped from taxes in the first sentence to extortion in the second sentence. This was an otherwise very interesting study, extortion with protection, understanding the effect of rebel taxation. You can see this kind of similar slippage throughout any sort of attempts to think about the question of rebel taxation. And obviously, I find that problematic because I'm not a libertarian. Right? I think it's a perfectly acceptable position if you are somebody who views all forms of taxation, including state taxation, as extortion, then this perspective makes sense. But I would suggest that many of the people who are making this kind of slippage wouldn't agree with that perspective. Right? So can we ever draw a line between taxation and extortion, and how would we do that? And in my view, it shouldn't be based on simply whether or not it's a state versus a non-state. There has to be some other set of logics through which we distinguish between these two types of revenue generation. So one approach that has come out, and I think I'm also trying to push back against this to some degree, is a purely kind of instrumental approach, right? That focuses on armed groups collecting taxes purely to fund their military and governance activities. This I find to be problematic as well, because I think armed groups are often much more complex. What's missing in a lot of these sorts of models of rebel taxation is any sort of politics. And I think my larger project has always been to try to understand the politics of how armed groups behave. And I think reducing them to the sort of instrumental logics denies us kind of a fuller grasp of the kind of complex sets of political and social behaviors that are involved with the practice of taxation generally, right? So a lot of this I've actually derived from state literature on taxation. If you read the state literature on taxation, most economists who study state and political scientists who study state forms of taxation will similarly emphasize that taxation is not a purely instrumental process. It's embedded with all of these social valences that I will talk about more here. And I'm going to suggest that armed groups use taxation in a similar fashion. So pushing back against this sort of competitive state building model, right? It's purely instrumental take that armed groups simply need to collect resources in order to fund their activities. There's a whole set of reasons why we can challenge this. The big one is that armed groups often have multiple sources of revenue shift from quite rapidly in the context of war. Most commonly these days, armed groups rely on funding from states, right, in ways that make the whole question of taxation kind of moot. But I think, the bigger point that I'm trying to push here is that this model of taxation for armed groups is fundamentally a top-down one, where the rebel leaders sort of decide that they need X amount of revenue, and they determine their tax policies accordingly. So it's a unidirectional model, right, where the agency rests solely with the leaders of the armed group itself. It's fundamentally an apolitical one, right? It doesn't look at any other factors, and they determine how armed groups actually set their tax policies. And in this way, I think it fails to capture a lot of what I think are really interesting dynamics about how armed groups actually go about implementing various types of tax regimes. So there's a number of more specific concerns that I explore in these different papers, and I'll talk about these today. First, the current models of rebel taxation cannot account for many different forms of taxation, right? So I'll talk about this concept of token or household taxes. These are exceedingly common. If you looked at the case of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in South Sudan, they would impose what they referred to as market taxes on these women. So back in 2004, 2005, when I first went to South Sudan, I was speaking with an SPLA commander after having visited the market and talking to market women who told me that they pay taxes. This was the first time I ever heard this concept. And I asked, this SPLA commander why it is that he was imposing taxes on these market women, right? Because the taxes that they were imposing were ridiculously small, like 25 cents. And he said it had nothing to do with revenue generation, right? Purely with the desire to know what was being sold in the market. So that was my first sort of insight that there was something more going on. And if you look at most studies of rebel taxation, they tend to exclude these forms of taxation, right? Household taxes are similarly, in the Naga case, which you read about, very common, right? So the Nagas would go door to door, try to collect a very small amount from these households. Oftentimes they would be expending more on trying to collect the tax than they would actually receive from the taxpayer themselves. And so why engage in these sorts of practices, right? If you are using a logic of economic instrumentalism, it doesn't make sense. These are tax practices that are revenue neutral, or in some cases actually revenue negative, meaning that they're losing money every time they actually try to collect one of these taxes. So why do it at all, right? There's another set of concerns, I think, in a lot of the studies that we've seen. They tend to focus on the most visible forms of rebel taxation, right? So taxes on businesses or other types of commercial actors. And especially there's a whole, very interesting literature that is emerging now on checkpoint taxes, right? Taxes imposed at border crossings, other checkpoints that armed groups may establish. I think, those are important studies, but they're only a partial picture of the larger story of rebel taxation, right? It is in those spaces that we tend to see a kind of economic instrumentalism most clearly, and that makes perfect sense to me. I'm not saying that there isn't economic logics as to why these armed groups engage in taxation, but if we generalize from just these forms of taxations, again, we miss this larger picture of what is actually happening in terms of how armed groups levy taxes on civilians. Which brings me to the next point, which is that most of these models have no role for civilian agency, right? How we think about taxes, is often determined not purely by the economic consequences of paying taxes. As I mentioned earlier, you could be a libertarian, and any amount of taxation to you would be unjust, right? It's not simply about how much you get back from paying those taxes. If you look at the United States, for example, the states that have the most anger towards paying taxes to the federal government are often those states that receive the most benefits from the federal government, right? And so the question of civilian agency is hugely important. It's not a kind of one-to-one transaction where you pay X amount of dollars and you assess whether it's worth it or not based on how many in services you receive, right? There are a much larger set of factors that shape how you feel about any particular taxation regime. And this is as true for armed groups as it is for state actors as well. And then finally, taxation is an expression of sovereignty. Taxation is something that armed groups deploy very consciously. There's a whole set of different tools that armed groups can use to raise funds, right? Ranging from, on one side, voluntary donations, which are very common for many armed groups to rely on in the context of war. This is something I saw in Sri Lanka with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Where women would often give their gold jewelry as a donation to the armed group. Is that a tax? Is that something else? I would suggest that it is distinct. Of course, extortion does exist. I'm in no way saying that extortion doesn't exist. But there is a whole range of practices that we should be paying attention to, and to conflate all of them into a singular logic is deeply problematic. There's also this important part of how armed groups themselves perceive the role of taxation. I'll talk more about that with the cases. So, when I started this project, I kind of had a set of very basic questions to try to understand how we can make sense of rebel taxation practices. If you read my work, much of it is really focused on trying to actually understand armed groups from sort of the ground up by actually spending time with, either armed groups or local communities that are controlled by different armed groups. And I think this is very important because a lot of the studies, especially coming out of economics, tend to rely on more abstract models to make sense of the behavior of armed groups. And oftentimes I find that kind of abstract reasoning to be lacking. And instead, what I would suggest, the approach that I've been trying to take is to ask more fundamental questions about how these dynamics actually operate in the field, right? And so I started with a very basic set of questions around who gets taxed, right? Whether these are concentrated or diffused in any sort of fashion, in what manner, right? Are they targeting certain sectors of the population with harsher taxes versus others? So are they regressive? Are they distributive, for example? And for what purpose, right? Why are they actually raising these funds? Again, the kind of economic logic would suggest that there are clear military or governance objectives, but I don't think that's always the case. The logics of taxation, for what purpose, in other words, can be either selectively ascribed either to specific ethnic communities, to specific class groups, as we'll talk about, or more collectively for the entire population. We see all these kind of logics that work. And once you start, doing this, when you look at the data around specific armed groups, what you see is that armed groups, even a singular armed group, may engage in a whole variety of different logics that shape their various taxation practices. Okay, so let me talk about the Naga case first, since you're somewhat familiar with this. This is a paper I wrote with an Indian PhD student named Shalika Thakur. She wasn't even a PhD student when we first started working on this. That's how long it's been. But we were able to, Shalika had spent a lot of time in the Northeast, and we were able to gather quite a bit of data about a specific group called the National Socialist Council of Nagaland. This is the entrance to the headquarters, part of India's Northeast called Hebron, that I visited. I think this is from like 2017. I had a chance to talk to the minister responsible for the tax system that is established in Nagaland. And what we try to do in this paper, and there are two major concepts I'll try to introduce today, is to think about taxation as a technology of governance. And by that, what we are interested in is how did the armed group use taxation as a method for constructing and maintaining a wartime order, right? A lot of very good literature on this concept of wartime orders and how army groups are involved in this process of establishing various types of wartime order. And we wanted to see, do taxes play a role in establishing these forms of wartime order? I'll come back to this in a bit. But our starting assumption here was that taxation can be a mechanism through which rebels seek to define, engage, regulate, and control civilian populations and commercial act. Right? And as opposed to kind of the logics of a top-down model, what we were really interested in are kind of interactive dimensions. Again, something we take from the state taxation literature, this idea of tax bargaining, right? So rather than a unidirectional thing, the way in which governments set tax rates is not simply determined by the priorities of the government itself, but often reflect this bargaining process, right? Where civilians who have agency indicate what they consider to be some sort of appropriate level of taxation versus what they consider to be onerous level of taxation. And it's through this process, actual taxation rates are set. Again, think about it in the own context of, say, the United States or whatever country you come from. What do you consider to be a onerous taxation rate? Is it 30%? Is it 90%? And we've had both of those rates here in the United States at various points on income taxes, for example. And that is driven not purely by, say, government need, but rather by this larger sort of negotiation process, or bargaining process, through which we, as a society, kind of determine what should be the upper level for taxation. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's any support in the United States, for example, to increase taxation rates above 39% at the highest rate that exists currently. And it seems unlikely, somehow 40% is considered to be, beyond the pale. And I think part of what we are interested in here is that if we start to view taxation in this way, it can tell us something larger about the field of rebel governance, right? A lot of the work on rebel governance that has been coming out is really engaged in this process of enumeration, right? So that there's a way in which we simply want to count how many schools were built by armed groups, how many hospitals were built by armed groups, how many roads were built by armed groups, and then suggest from that that you can make some sort of qualitative statement about the state of rebel governance in these particular territories. And I think that, again, misses the actual dynamics of governance that we are interested in. Taxation provides us a method through which we can try to capture the texture of it. Right? What I think more accurately captures how do people feel about any particular governance regime. Okay? I'll say more about this in a minute. All right, so for this paper, we wanted to do a subnational comparison, right? So our approach here was to say, we think there are two factors that are important in determining the kind of taxation regimes that will be established within any particular territory. And, we sort of came up with this 2x2 of different kind of possibilities based on two factors that we thought were important: the degree of military control and the degree of political legitimacy. This created 4 different types for us: the hegemon, the extortionist, the lover, and tender. We had some expectations about what taxation regimes would look like based on these two factors. I won't read all of these since you saw the paper already, but you get the idea. We expect to see some considerable variation in the nature of the taxation regimes that were established. And our approach here was to look at 4 subnational cases within areas of NSCN-IM control, specifically Chandal, Dimapur, Ukrul, and Tamenglong. And they vary in very interesting ways. Some of them are more urban spaces, others are more rural. There are ethnic differences in each of these different specific territories. Some of these areas are areas of monopoly control where the NSCN is the only group that is operational. In other cases, if you're familiar with Northeast India, you had something like 8 different groups that were operating within the same territory. And so all of these things were important for us to try to take seriously. And we basically went around, speaking to traditional leaders, business owners, civil society leaders, members of the NSCN-IM itself, as well as people from different armed groups and people in the army. So the Northeast is a very unique case in some ways. We can talk about this more later, but the basic idea here is that unlike a situation of active conflict, there is basically a long-term ceasefire that shapes the region where the Indian state basically allows all of these armed groups to operate. So the Indian state is an omnipresent actor within its territory, within these territories. But the armed groups do have a considerable degree of autonomy from the Indian state as well. It's a kind of complex and rapidly evolving situation. And our basic approach was to try to collect tax receipts and documentation and supplement them with interviews from people who are affected by these various taxation practices. So here's just a quote from one of the NSCN officials that we spoke to. This is the Secretariat of Home Affairs. This is the office that actually sets the tax policy. And here I think this kind of captures the kind of sovereign logics that we were very interested in. So part of the struggle in the Northeast is who actually represents the Naga cause. Right? Of course, you have the Indian states, which makes its own set of sovereign claims over the Naga people. But then you also have these multiple armed groups, all of which are competing to be the sole representative of the Naga people, right? The Naga struggle. And this is a very clear logic that shapes the NSCN tax practice. As this official told us, paying tax to the NSCN is in itself a political demonstration of indicating that Naga people pay tax to the Naga government and not the occupying force. We saw a very similar kind of logic when we looked at the FARC, as I'll talk about here, also with the SPLA, this idea that, you know, as a government, which is how these armed groups viewed themselves within these territories, they had a legitimate right to collect taxes, not simply for revenue generation, but as a demonstration of their sovereign prerogatives. Here is some of the evidence that we, tried to collect. These are receipts that were paid. I think, as you can see, one of the points that we try to develop here is that, what distinguishes this from sort of extortion is that it had been regularized, right? So that the rates were published in advance. That these were not ad hoc taxes, that they were always documented in some form. Receipts were always issued whenever these payments were made. If a business owner or a civilian had complaints about the kind of taxes that were being levied on them, in other words, if a tax collector was engaging in extortion, they actually could show these receipts and seek redress from the armed group itself. And we talk about some examples of that in the paper. And again, I think all of this is just a way to demonstrate very clearly that this is not simple extortion, right? That there is something else that is going on here that we need to be able to discuss as a form of taxation. The other thing that we wanted to do is to say, as I mentioned earlier, rather than focusing on taxes that are most likely to conform to our expectations of economic instrumentalism, let's start by trying to catalog the whole range of taxes that these armed groups are implementing on civilian populations, right? Again, if you're only looking at checkpoints, right, sites of mineral extraction, sites of drug production, you're likely to find behaviors that conform to your expectations of economic instrumentalism. But if instead you start by looking at the range of different taxes that the armed groups engage in or implement, what you find is that there can be very different logics that shape each of these different categories of taxation. That was a big part of our objective with this project, is trying to just document all of the different types of taxes that these groups are implementing. What do we find? By and large, our case studies conform to our theoretical expectations. The extortionist was the one that we found they departed the most from our expectations. Our expectations there, again, that it would be a much more coercive process. So this is the situation in which the armed group has a high degree of military control but lacks political legitimacy. And so we sort of assumed that would be an opportunity. This was the site where we assumed that the group would behave in the most extortionary practices. And we were actually surprised that even as it departed from the other cases, it actually was more consistent with their tax practices in the other territories as well. Okay. So our conclusion here in this first paper was that taxation is driven by political as much, if not more, than economic logics. Right. All right, let me keep moving on. Since I don't have that much time, I'll talk about this other paper, which you didn't have a chance to read, but I think it was also a really interesting project for us. This is something that I wrote with Jose Antonio Gutierrez Danton, who is a Colombian scholar who is based in Ireland. Jose has done some really interesting work. He spent something like 18 months in FARC territories, has really just collected a trove of documents around the FARC's taxation practices. And we were particularly interested in the FARC because, of course, there is this whole discourse around narco taxes, right? The FARC as a particular type of group that has benefited from the cocaine trade in particular, right? And we wanted to sort of push back against some of this framing. How do we think about taxes on drugs? And just to give you a sense of it, we can look going back. This is a quote from Stanley Wang, who was writing about China in 1935. So you see, I won't read this whole quote for you, but you can get a sense, right, of this very strong association between the role of drugs and state building, right? This assumption that once drugs become an important source of revenue for a governance actor, that it has this necessarily deleterious effect that the actor will go through some sort of process of deterioration in terms of their relations to governance and civilian population more generally. This is not a new theory, right? Although it did get a lot more attention back in the early 2000s when there was a similar kind of political economy logic that was shaping a lot of the analysis of armed groups. Yeah.
Can I ask, sorry, on the quote, the linking of, this is the weakening of race. Can you say a little bit about that? I mean,
Yeah.
I know this is like, you're not, like, this is not your area, but I was just
No,
like, that
it's-
stuck out to me as like an interesting, I
I
haven't seen that link before necessarily.
think it's actually hugely important, right? I think that part of what we were trying to capture is that much of how, so if you read the paper, which is more of a historical paper, right? Much of the discourse around how drugs shape governance are shaped by these sort of moralistic assumptions, right? And I think that this is true for the study of armed groups generally, as you know, but particularly when we talk about their involvement in the drug trade. So it's taken as almost as a truism that as soon as the armed group gets involved with the drug trade, they go through this process of deterioration. And to us, that's a moral claim, right? It reflects how individuals feel about the drug trade, conditioned by now 3 decades of the war on drugs, that has really relied on a set of what I would consider to be loose associations, right? This idea that if they are engaging in the coca trade, then they must be these sort of nefarious actors. And we can see how dramatic this is, right? So you could, after the war on terror, this sort of new discourse came where you had this word association, right? So this rebels turn narcos premise. This is something that Jose wrote about with Francisco Gutierrez Senate, where they sort of show that after 9/11, there was a sort of concerted efforts to refer to the FARC as narco terrorists, right? So you just bring all the bogeymen together and create this new category. Right. And what is driving that? Is it because the FARC has suddenly become much more violent towards civilians? Are they starting to engage in much more, illogical actions in regards to their larger political struggles? And there's no evidence of that. It is purely a kind of normative or moral claim about the nefarious impacts of drugs on the morality of any sort of political struggle. Right. And that, I think, is a huge part of what we were trying to push back against. Right. Is it how useful are these concepts that social scientists will then imbue and treat as real? I mean, this is, I don't want to go on a tangent too much, but the whole discourse around terrorism is driven largely by the same sort of logic, right? What is terrorism? How do we distinguish terrorism from rebellion? Terrorism it's not an analytical concept, similar to drugs, right? We refer to narcos, narco terrorists, narco guerrillas, narco rebels. And it's not meant to say something meaningful, because again, as with almost all the groups that we looked at, a whole range of groups that have been involved with drug production or the drug trade in some way, Taliban, Al-Shabaab, many groups, right? Some of these groups are just like putting a foot in the water, others make it much more central to their entire identity, but it doesn't seem to have this kind of overwhelming power, right, that is often ascribed to it. That is exactly what we were trying to challenge. What are the actual effects of this, right? In particular, we're trying to challenge this sort of thesis that again was very popular in the early 2000s. You can see it in the work of people like Jeremy Weinstein and others. This idea that there's this negative relationship between narcotics and rebel behavior, that once an armed group starts getting involved in the drug trade, that they will necessarily undergo some sort of devolution in relation to the civilian population, right? This is what has been deemed the rebels turn narcos premise. And on the other side, we had interviews with commanders of the FARC-EP, who fundamentally rejected this premise, right? They were basically like, look, drugs mean nothing to us, right? As this commander told us, you see the same we tax oil companies or cattle ranchers, we tax cocaine production. And we were sort of suspicious of both of these narratives, right? One, that drugs possess this unique power to transform a revolutionary group into a bunch of terrorists, or the other that, this major source of revenue that emerged for the FARC had no impact on its larger behavior. So could we actually discern the impacts of the cocaine trade on the tax practices of the FARC? And so in contrast to the previous study, which we use this sort of subnational approach, our desire here was much more historical, right? We wanted to try to understand this across time and see how how the introduction of cocaine taxes changed the behavior of the armed group. So to come back, our interest here was on this idea of wartime order, which has been, I think, well defined by people like Anna Arjona, Stanoland. This is a quote from Anna, who has studied the FARC for a long time. And this is what she was trying to capture in her conception of wartime social order, right? Paul has a similar kind of approach where he's focused more on the politics. So Anna's focus is more on the relations between the armed group and the local civilian population. Paul is on the relationship between different armed groups and the state, right? And our interest is on specifically, how do economic forces shape this larger wartime order? So we try to develop this idea of a wartime economic order, right? By which we are referring to the economic arrangements made by armed groups that are predictable and structured with the primary goal of funding the war effort. In particular, we were interested in the various types of taxation on civilians and industries, businesses, levying fees and duties, seeking donations, as well as the activities deemed illegal by the state, such as kidnapping, bank robberies, or involvement in the drug trade. And our desire here was to see how the FARC's tax practices or fundraising practices shifted over time. To do this, we looked at a variety of different areas in the coca producing regions under the control of the FARC. We looked at both internal documents as well as talking to people involved in coca production, as well as members of the FARC as well. And our goal was to try to compare how the FARC was taxing coca to how the FARC was taxing other types of products, since they were engaged in a whole range of economic activities, as I mentioned earlier. Colombia, of course, is a very useful site for this kind of research because it is the dominant producer of cocaine globally, something like 70%, according to the United Nations Office of Drug Control. And it's also a really interesting case because it's a long-standing armed group. It's probably the most studied armed group in the world, arguably. We know a lot about their governance practices, thanks to the work of people like Anna. And so we were able to sort of see very clearly how taxation relates to these larger governance practices. All right, what we were able to argue in the paper is that the FARC was driven very much by this Leninist model of finance, right? Not surprising, the FARC-EP is a Marxist group. And over from our kind of review of the evolution of the FARC's taxation practices, we see this desire to set a tax policy in line with what they considered a Leninist model. Right? In other words, that the tax practices of the armed group should reflect the proletarian character of the struggle itself. What do they mean by this? Over and over, as I'll show you a little bit here, the central command of the FARC is trying to impose greater discipline over tax collection practices, to try to make tax collection as equitable as possible, to emphasize collectivism, and strong supervision over a decentralized structure. Right. This really starts in 1983 at the 7th conference, where the FARC started to first lay out its formalize its taxation policies. Until this point, taxation of the drug trade in Colombia goes back to the 1940s and 1950s. You can see elements of armed groups getting involved in marijuana production, going back that far. But by and large, it had been a somewhat ad hoc set of practices. Right? And in 1983, at the 7th conference, is the first time that the FARC command decided that they should try to set some sort of uniform policy over how taxes are collected by the various fronts. It's a huge territory. At one point, the FARC controls something like 40% of Colombia's territory. It's very decentralized. Some of these areas are quite remote from each other. They're quite inaccessible to each other. And so you had a highly decentralized system where many different types of tax practices were in play, partially related again to the nature of local economic production. Not all of the FARC's territory is coca producing. And so in the areas where coca is produced, you would see one set of tax practices. In other areas, you see different types of tax practices. And so in 83, the FARC decided that they wanted to try to establish more of a uniform policy over tax collection across its various territories. In 1993, at the 8th conference, they introduced the so-called peace tax. I'll show you what this looks like. In 2000, they actually formalized this in Ley Número 2, law number 2, where they actually lay out their tax policy. And in 2009, they again made changes to the tax policies within the FARC territories in order to make it more redistributed. Right? So let me just show you a little bit of what this looks like. So this is Ley Número 2 sobre la tributación, law number 2 about taxation. And you can see, so this is the Spanish version, but this is basically the English version of what I just showed you. I think there's a few different things here that are interesting to point out. There's an emphasis on voluntary contributions. The question of coercion hangs over all of this, as it does with any issue of taxation. I won't say too much here about it, but how the armed groups frame their relationship to coercion in relation to the question of taxation is really interesting. But even groups like the FARC, which did engage in extortion, right? Kidnappings were common, at least during certain phases of the war. They would distinguish those kinds of practices from what they consider to be voluntary contributions or taxation. The other thing that I want to point out here is that you start to see the creation of taxation, of a taxation regime in FARC territories that adheres to some sort of class logic, right? So the targets, again, consistent with the FARC's orientation as a Marxist-Leninist group, were heavily weighted towards taxing the wealthy, right? And so corporations who had revenues exceeding $1 million were the main targets of these taxation policies. All right, so what we try to do is then to look at these sort of taxes on coca in relation to tax on other types of commodities that the FARC was taxing in their territories, as well as other types of sources of funding, right? Again, this goes back to my earlier point, is that armed groups often have multiple sources of revenue. So this, for those of you who are familiar with the sort of political economy of literature, this is why we don't think that revenue sources can be so determinative of the behavior of the armed group itself. Because one of the things that almost every armed group that has to survive across decades, like the FARC, needs to be able to do is to shift between various funding sources as certain opportunities open up and others close down. This is all unfolding in the context of Colombia. This is a period in which the United States drastically ramped up their involvement in the Colombian conflict, right? And as sort of opportunities to tax cocaine production shut down, the FARC is constantly having to shift from where it's generating revenue. In order to do this, it develops a fairly complex system of revenue generation that targeted all of these different sectors, right? And as I mentioned earlier, this also has a huge regional dimension to it, right? Certain areas that were heavily involved in coca production, but others where you had different types of taxation regimes that took into account the local political economy that was operational in those areas. To give a sense, and this is all difficult work to do in some ways because we're trying to rely on estimates of how much revenue was generated from, say, coca. How do you do that? We don't have any sort of clear-cut picture of overall revenues coming into the FARC organization. So take it for what it's worth. This is according to commanders. We wanted to get a sense of how much of a share of total revenue came from drug taxes. According to the commanders that we spoke to, coca represented a maximum of 60% of revenues in different regions. So the overall share of taxes probably never really, from coca specifically, never really surpassed 50% of their total revenues, right? Again, because they had this diversified approach. And what we sort of, found here is that there was a considerable amount of variation in coca taxation, both across time and space, but it always adhered to this class-based logic, right? So for example, the FARC would not implement taxes on small producers, right? They would instead target people further up the production chain, and they would be the ones who would actually have to pay the tax to the armed group. This makes sense if you think about it, right? If you think about coca producers as the constituency that the FARC is trying to mobilize, you don't want to impose very onerous taxes on precisely that population. Right? We saw across the different cases that we looked at, that this logic was largely adhered to by the FARC. So our argument here was, wartime economic order. The coca taxes were very central to the establishment of these different wartime economic orders, and that these economic orders could vary widely, even within the FARC areas of control, based on the class composition of the region, the nature of the economic activities, and the ideological commitments of the specific commanders operating within these territories. Taxation, again, in contrast to how we might think about armed group behavior, was never very rigid. It was highly flexible and negotiated. Spoke to quite a few, business people, small farmers who paid these taxes, and they would always emphasize their capacity to negotiate their tax burden with the FARC commanders. Over and over, we saw evidence that it served very much as a regulatory tool to maintain social order as much as it did as a mechanism to raise funds. We had stories of the FARC imposing, for example, sin taxes or vice taxes on certain communities, supposedly as a response to women complaining that their men were getting too drunk. Right? And so how do you stop that behavior? They would increase the tax on beer to reduce alcohol consumption. Again, we don't know. These stories could be apocryphal, but these were stories that were being told by civilians living in these communities. And in some ways, Jose has gone back to some of these communities and they've complained that after the signing of the peace agreement between the FARC and the government, that these communities have become much more disorderly, right? Because the FARC is no longer playing these kind of roles. We saw evidence of that same logic with Al-Shabaab, with the Taliban, similarly have used such vice and sin taxes, right? Again, think about what a vice tax is, right? If you're relying on a logic of economic instrumentalism, it doesn't make sense to impose vice taxes because you're trying to raise the cost of a good so high that it actually decreases consumption, right? And so for the FARC to engage in these kinds of practices suggests that it's not simply a tool for maximizing the amount of resources they can extract. The other thing I would just say here is, imposing taxes is never cost-free, right? So it's, again, not this pure blank slate. We saw quite a bit of resistance to this. This was very clear in the FARC case, where, the taxes on the wealthy in particular generated considerable degrees of resistance. The paramilitaries that emerged in Colombia in the 1990s in particular were largely in response. So the FARC did actually have some wealthier supporters in earlier periods, but as the tax system became more regularized and more targeted towards elites within Colombian society, the elites didn't simply sit around and accept this, right? They started to fund paramilitaries, which became a major threat to the FARC's ability to control territory. So it's this very complex political game that they're playing. And I think interestingly, as we sort of show in the paper, there was also resistance from the poor based on the FARC's perceived deviations from their ideological commitments. So as I mentioned earlier, the sort of negotiated nature of the tax regime would often lead the FARC to allow wealthy landowners or business people to remain, to engage in practices that the poorer elements of those societies did not like. And that could generate its own resistance from within the FARC's preferred constituency. Okay, so let me just end, because I know I'm out of time here, but just to give you a sense of where we might want to go with some of these ideas, and this is more speculative, but I think it's interesting. How do we think about taxation itself? So what have I taken away from this larger process? It has led me down some interesting directions. I'm not sure where it's going to land, but I think it's useful. In particular, in terms of how do we think about armed groups and their relationship to taxation, right? And one of the couple of things that I've been thinking about is that we're so trapped in these state logics of taxation that we may miss other forms of exchange that exist between armed groups and local populations that could be productively illuminated if we think of them more broadly as forms of taxation. Right? Perhaps the most common that we ignore because states don't engage in this practice anymore, by and large, is forced labor. Right? Around the world, many armed groups require labor contributions from local communities. Right? This can range from actually forcibly recruiting people to participate in the armed struggle itself, as well as playing much more quotidian roles behind the scenes, right? Forcing farmers, for example, to harvest their fields in order to support the war effort. What do we make of this, right? Can we apply the logic of taxation to make sense of such very common practices? Generally, I haven't seen too many efforts to do this, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment, at least, but also something that could productively be turned into a part of this larger project. And it goes back to something I've always sort of thought about the rebel governance literature, is that we shouldn't rely too heavily on analogies to state behavior, right? That armed groups have always coexisted alongside the state, that we shouldn't always assume that everything they're doing is necessarily a form of proto-state formation, right? That there may be different logics that shape their behavior. They may have different kinds of constraints as well as opportunities on their behavior that we should be paying attention to without always assuming that they have to follow the state logic. And I think forced labor is a very useful one, right? Because of course, forms of corvée labor have always been very common to states, right? In pre-modern and colonial periods, we know that states around the world relied on forced labor. This, by and large, at least, officially ended in 1930 with the ILO's convention concerning forced or compulsory labor. But we still see elements of it today, right? We could look at the kafala system in the Gulf. We could look at prison labor in the United States, right? And that may provide us with a useful lens through which we understand the fairly common practice of armed groups using forced labor. And again, I'm always trying to avoid a kind of moralizing language, because so many of our morals around what is permissible for authorities to engage in is shaped by our view of what is permissible for states to engage in, right? And I think, by pushing these sort of kind of provocative analogies, we can glean something about the behavior of armed groups, because of course they do rely on such behaviors commonly, and I don't think we should simply dismiss them based on our kind of state-driven morality, right? Perhaps even more controversially, one-child policies, should we think of that as a form of tax? We know that many armed groups rely on one-child policies in order to recruit individuals to participate in their struggles. So a common example would be families being expected to donate one child to the local group. Again, international law prohibits such practices, so by and large, states don't openly engage in such practices. But really what it comes down to is this question of consent, right? Our normative lens assumes that children cannot give consent, and that parents who give their child to the armed group are being forced to do this, right? Due to threat of coercion. And I think you can look into it and you can find many examples. So this is a quote from a woman whose sons participated in the Sikh insurgency in northern India back in the 1980s. And she says, I have only 2 sons. If they get sacrificed for Khalistan, it will be through the great grace of the Guru. They will be able to give back what was the gift of God to us. What do we make of this? Is it useful to assume that the only thing that drives such behaviors is coercion or the threat of coercion, right? That is our fundamental model that shapes, the laws around war crimes or crimes against humanity, so on and so forth. But I don't think it actually captures the more nuanced dynamic that is involved in these sorts of relationships, right? And they're remarkably common. see it across the world, such examples of armed groups relying on one-child policies to man their struggles. And I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of avoid the moralizing logic and try to make sense of the underlying dynamics. I'll end it with that. Thank you so much.